In today's colour grading tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how you can create this warm, faded, black and white wedding look in your photos inspired by Taylor Swift's new album, The Tortured Poets Department, in Lightroom. And I'm going to start right now. So before we go ahead and jump onto Lightroom and start editing photos, let's have a look at a few sample images. And the main reason I wanted to come up with this effect is I was really inspired when I looked inside the vinyl. The vinyl of the Tortured Poets Department's got some really nice photos, and I wanted to kind of recreate this effect. I was really inspired by it, especially for my wedding couples that are often also Taylor Swift fans. So as you can see by some of the sample photos, we can see that we're going for this black and white look, although it's not truly black and white. It's got this ever so slight hue to the overall global colour. Also, you'll notice in the shadow regions that the blacks aren't true black. They've got this faded look to them, as well as they've got a little bit of grain and also a little bit of a vignette. And overall, these photos are quite dark with an overall really nice global colour to them. So although they're not black and white, they are actually got a slight hue, which is definitely something we can create in Lightroom. Now, this effect will work with pretty much all style of photos, but specifically, I'm going to be applying it to a portrait photo or more studio photo, but it also works with weddings as well. So you might want to experiment to see how well this particular preset works with your style of photography. So this is the photo we're going to be working with today. Now, if you notice, we're already in the develop panel. So what I'm going to do is just drop down to the basic sliders. Now, with this effect, I was shooting in manual white balance, so I was shooting at 5100 Kelvin with a +2 tint, and that's the correct white balance for the scene. As well, as you can see, I have just literally boosted up the exposure. So the very first thing we want to do is actually convert this photo into black and white. That'll be the very first stage. So that's super easy. All you need to do is go to this black and white button that you can see at the top, click, and as you can see, we have now converted this photo into black and white. But do bear in mind that obviously color balance can change your exposure, so make sure you've got the right white balance before you convert the photo into black and white, and it's the same with your overall exposure. I've just boosted it up by 1. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to our contrast here. I'm going to go ahead and increase it by 5. Then I'm going to go to my highlights, drop that down by -10, not by a large amount, but we want to create this matty effect in the shadows. And the best way to do that is simply go to the shadow regions we can see here. We're going to increase that by quite a large amount. So I'm going to go ahead and increase this by 70. Then lastly, I've got my blacks and whites here. I'm going to go ahead and increase the whites by 10 and decrease the blacks by -10. This will help get a little bit more information in the far whites and far blacks of our image. Then we'll move to texture, clarity, and dehaze. What we're going to do with texture here is increase that by 5. Now, because we're working with a portrait photo, what I'm going to do is going to go to my clarity slider here. I'm going to drop that down by -25. Now, the reason I've done this is if you're ever working with any skin tones or anything like that, what you want to do is slightly soften them. And the best way to do that is just simply reduce the clarity slider. But if you're working on a landscape photo, I recommend increasing the clarity. So this is where you might want to create, if you are creating a preset for this, you might want to create 2, one for portrait photos or studio photos, wedding photos, things like that, and the rest maybe create one with a landscape photo, simply because we're actually going to be decreasing the clarity in portrait photos and increasing the clarity in landscape and maybe architecture photos. So once you've done that, all we need to do now is simply move to dehaze, and then all we're going to do is increase dehaze by +10. And pretty much that's all we're going to be doing in the basic sliders. So we're going to turn that off, and now we're going to go ahead to tone curve. And this is where we're going to create that faded look, that kind of very soft, matty look that we can see in the blacks and shadow regions of these photos. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go to the blacks on the very far left, make sure we're in the point curve, not the parametric curve. It's not possible using that. Make sure we're in the point curve. We're going to go to the very far left-hand side, so input of 0. And what we're going to do is we're going to put the output here, and we're going to increase that all the way to 35, really brightening up those blacks. But we don't want to brighten up the overall photo. We want to create a bit more of a balanced exposure. So then what I recommend doing is creating a very soft C curve. So what we're going to do is go to our midtones and simply bring that down until you have found that the overall exposure is a little bit better. So I'm going to go for maybe slightly darker, and then what I probably recommend doing is maybe brightening up the highlights just a little bit. So we want to go for this very soft C curve that we can see here. Now again, what you can do is actually go back into your exposure in your basics panel and increase that if you are finding it's a little bit too dark, or a little bit too bright. The idea of the tone curve is we're just creating that matte effect that you can see in the shadows and the black regions of your photo. So you want to end up with an effect or a C curve, a very soft curve that looks very similar to this. Okay, so what we're going to do is turn off the tone curve here. We're going to skip the black and white. We're not going to be affecting that in this photo. And we're going to go to color grading. Now you might be thinking, why are we going into color grading? The photo's black and white. Well, what's really nice about the color grading panel is it still works as an overlay for black and white photos. So you can actually apply a color to a black and white image as like an overlay, like a screen overlay that you'd be able to do in Photoshop. Now, instead of separating them into shadows, midtones, and highlights, what we're going to do instead is go to the global color here. So this will apply a color to the entire photo evenly. Now, as you can see by some of the sample photos, again, I'll show you them now, you can see there's an ever so slight yellowish orangish tinge to the entire image. And that's what we're going to apply using the color grading panel. So what we're going to do, select the global color here. I'm going to select a hue of 35 because that's the color I found Taylor Swift seems to use in her photos. Then you just want to increase the saturation. Now, this is really up to personal preference. You could be really strong, something like this, but I actually found around 20 seems to be optimum to recreate Taylor Swift's style. So you can see it's got a very slight color tinge to it, but it's not that strong. If you want a softer look, decrease the saturation, and if you want a stronger look, increase the saturation. You can see this is the color that we're basically applying. It's this very orangey yellowy color, and that's basically all you'll need to do. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually apply this effect different brightness or different saturation to the highlights, midtones, and shadows if that's something you wanted to do. But I found that you could spend hours just messing around with the highlights, midtones, and shadows, and you end up with the same effect if you just simply applied it globally. So I'd recommend just apply it globally. But if you do want to be a little bit more specific over how much hue you're adding into the shadows, midtones, and highlights, then you can actually separate that using the color grading panel. Okay. So let's turn off the color grading panel. What we're going to do now is just go to details. Now, if you do want to sharpen the image, this is where you can do that, as well as noise reduction. But I'm actually going to be adding in grain later on, so I'm not too fussed with noise reduction. The only thing I'm actually going to be getting rid of is color noise reduction. But obviously, we've converted the photo into black and white, so that's something you don't necessarily have to worry about. But if you want a cleaner image and you want to remove noise from your photo, that's something you can do here. And if you want to sharpen it, that's also what you can do just at the top here. But to be honest with you, I'm just going to leave it as default. Okay, so let's turn off that, and all we're going to do now is drop down to effects. Now we want to apply two effects to this photo, a post-cropping vignette as well as grain, and both of these are more optional extra. I like adding these in because it looks like Taylor has in her kind of style that she's gone for with her both vinyl photos as well as the photo shoot that she went on. So that's what I'm going to be doing in my photos, but again, it's a little bit more optional extra. Really depends on if you like that style for your photos. So what I'm going to do is go to my post-cropping vignette, go to my amount here, I'm going to go to -20. I'm going to go ahead and select -20 here, and then I'm going to go to my feather here. I'm going to increase that all the way to 75. So although we're adding in quite a strong vignette, we're adding a slightly softer vignette, so it's not as noticeable in your photos, but it's great especially if you've got a model or your main kind of interest in the center of your photo. And then lastly here, we're going to add in grain. So I recommend zooming in for this. I'll probably zoom in to about 200%. And then you're going to go ahead and add in some grain. So what I like adding in is 30 amount. I like changing the size down to 20, and then roughness I like keeping at 50. And as you can see, we've added in this really nice grain effect. Now, if you want to apply more grain to the background and not necessarily the foreground, then what I recommend doing is going to your masking panel, selecting the background as your mask, and then dropping all the way down. And as you can see, you can now apply grain just to the background if that's something you wanted to do. But to be honest with you, I like adding grain to the entire photo because sometimes there isn't a foreground and background, and I don't want my preset to sometimes work with my images. I want it to always work. So because of that, I don't often apply masks to presets, especially if it's a multi-use preset that I apply it to landscape and portrait photos. But as you can see, it was actually a really simple effect. Now what I might do is jump back up to the basics panel here. What I might do is just add a little bit more exposure, as you can see. And then what I might do in this particular image, I might go down to color grading. I might actually add in a little bit of a stronger, I might go for 30 in this image. You can see, actually no, let's go for 25. Let's go for 25 here. And as you can see, I'm really happy with this effect. So what I can do is quickly show you the before and the after. And what I can do is now have a comparison against Taylor's photo shoot photos, the Torture Poe Department's album cover, and you can see they look really similar. So if you do like this effect and you want to apply it to your wedding photos, as you can see, it's really simple to apply in Lightroom. Brilliant, and there we go guys. So that is how you can create this beautiful, warm, faded look in your photos inspired by Taylor Swift's new album. And of course, don't forget to save it as a preset so you can copy and paste it to the rest of your gallery. As well as if you want to support this channel and you like any of the Lightroom Classic videos that I've done, make sure to go to the link in the description where you can actually buy my wedding presets, including the one that we've done today. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.